guys, so this week we are continuing with our study on the different kingdoms of life, and we've kind of been going pretty quick through them. Today is going to be no different with plants, but just to kind of recap what we've talked about so far, we've gone through archaea and eubacteria, both of those kingdoms of bacteria. We talked about that last week. Monday, I had you guys watch a video about Kingdom Protista. I consider them like the junk drawer of life, and honestly, I really enjoy talking about them, like the amoebas, the plasmodiums, or the parameciums, things like that. Uh, it's just interesting to see how broad life can be. Yesterday, I had you guys look at the kingdom fungi and how they consume things. They're not producers, they're consumers. For a long time, they were grouped with plants, but we know they're much different now. And I'm going to briefly talk about them again at the end of this video, just to kind of recap some things that I think you should know about that. And then next week, we're going to talk about Kingdom Animalia. But right now, what I want to focus on is Kingdom Plantae, or just the plant kingdom. Plantae is the fancy way of saying it in Latin. But we're going to talk about plants today. So, the kingdom of plants. This is another one that today what we're going to be going through is just how plants are generally classified. We're going to give a little bit basics about plant anatomy. But for the start here, we're going to just look at plant classification. And this is where remembering King Philip came over for good spaghetti will come in handy, because what we have here is kingdom, division, class, order, family, genus, species. And if you noticed already, we have something that's different. When we're talking about plants, instead of having a phylum, we have what's known as a division. And these divisions divide up our plants into basically two broad categories, which are going to be seedless plants and seed plants. But you can also see here that we have something known as vascular plants and non-vascular plants, so they call it subkingdoms. And then we also have other divisions besides the superdivisions that are angiosperms and gymnosperms, and then within that we have our classes of monocots and dicots and so on and so forth. And so all this to say that plant classification, it's trickier than it looks. And so what I want you guys to do is go ahead, I know you have your guided notes to go along with this, but go ahead and on a separate sheet of paper, kind of make this little diagram that you see here. So I'm just going to let you pause the video, and I want you to draw this diagram, because we're going to be going through the plants. So up here at plants, that's our broadest classification. Then we divide plants into two large groups, vascular plants and non-vascular plants. We'll be talking about that in a minute. Then we divide those vascular plants into plants with seeds and plants without seeds. Then those get divided into two more groups. There should be another arrow here pointing to angiosperms and gymnosperms. And then last but not least, we're going to divide our angiosperms into two different groups known as monocots and dicots. So go ahead, pause this video, write down this little diagram, know that it's going from broad to specific, and this will help you as we move throughout this today. Alright, so our first large grouping of plants, we divide the entire plant kingdom into the subkingdoms of vascular and non-vascular plants. Now, how can you tell the difference if you're looking at a plant? Like, how do I know if it's a vascular or a non-vascular plant? Well, to spot the difference, you kind of have to know what a vascular bundle is, which we honestly haven't talked about yet. And just kind of to quickly give you the answer to this question, vascular plants have vascular tissue, kind of self-explanatory in the name. And vascular plants or non-vascular plants do not, hence the term non. Now, when we're talking about vascular, think like vessels or veins and arteries, because that's kind of what vascular tissue is for us. It's our veins and arteries, things that transport our blood. Now, plants don't have blood, but they have water that they need and this other nutrients that is like a sugary consistency. Think of the sap of a plant. Those need to go all throughout the plant, and so they're going to use this stuff known as vascular tissue to do that. And so vascular plants have vascular tissue. that vascular tissue is made up of two different types known as xylem and phloem. Xylem is going to be transporting water. Phloem is going to be transporting a sugar-like solution throughout the plant. And a vascular bundle is just when that xylem and that phloem are kind of grouped together. This is easiest seen when you're looking at a leaf. If you see veins on a leaf, those are vascular bundles that are all grouped together to give that leaf that structure. Likewise, just look at the rings on this tree here. Now, if you know anything about tree rings show us age and how old a tree is, because each ring supposedly represents a growth season or a year sometimes. At least these really defined ones. Those are like the summer wood, it's called. And what this actually is, these rings are made because of vascular bundles. It's the xylem and phloem together. So, really quick, this is just what a vascular bundle looks like. Here you can see a xylem that's transporting the water, the phloem on the outside transporting that sugary solution, that sap. And the way it works is basically like a straw. So kind of think of the stem of a plant. How in the world is water from the ground where the roots are at, how is that getting all the way up into the leaves at the very top of, let's say, a 40-foot tree or even a 200-foot tree? It takes a lot of pressure to do that. And so some of that is just atmospheric pressure, where you can see here actually with your straw, just normal pressure is going to push some of that fluid up. But then there's also like this sucking motion that pushes the water up as well. And what that sucking motion is for plants, it's not necessarily the plants putting any more pressure on, but that water is actually going to evaporate through the plants through a process known as transpiration. And so we're going to see that in a little bit. But just to recap, vascular plants have vascular tissue, and non-vascular plants do not. Vascular tissue is just xylem and phloem, these tube-like cells that are going to be transporting stuff, very similar to the way a straw transports liquids. All right? So let's look at our non-vascular plants for a second before we move on. Non-vascular plants kind of really break the mold of what a plant is, you could say, because they don't have vascular tissues, meaning they're not going to have that xylem and phloem, and because of that, they can't transport substances very high, so they're going to stay relatively short and near the ground, where they can kind of just get water through diffusion, kind of soaking it up almost like a sponge. That's why you see mosses and stuff like that. They're always going to be in these cool, damp environments because they need places where the water is close to them. So if you haven't caught on yet, when we're talking about non-vascular plants, it's going to be things like true mosses. And another thing about this, because they don't have that vascular tissue, they don't have typical plant organs. And when I say plant organs, you might be thinking of, well, plants don't have hearts or lungs or digestive systems, and you're absolutely correct. They don't. But if we remember all the way back to the very beginning of biology, when we talked about the definition of an organ, it's when you have two or more different types of tissue coming together to perform a simple function. So xylem and phloem are considered two different types of tissue, and when they come together, they develop these plant organs. So we have three main types of plant organs: stems, leaves, and roots. Sometimes a fourth organ is considered the reproductive organ, which is the flower. But not all plants have flowers, and we'll be talking about that later on in this video. But right now, just kind of know that our three main plant organs are stems, leaves, and roots. And through basic biology and life science, all the way through even elementary, you knew what a stem was by looking at it. You knew what roots were by looking at it, and you knew what leaves were by looking at it. However, not all plants look like this nice little diagram here that are easy to identify. Sometimes roots and stems and even leaves are trickier to identify than we might think of originally. For example, think of a cactus. The spines on a cactus that you see, those really pointy things, those are actually modified leaves. And so, how do we know it's a leaf? Well, because it's attached at this place called the node. And these nodes are just these kind of like little bumpy areas that we find on the stem. And so we classify anything that has a node as a stem. We classify anything that's attached at the node as a leaf. And then if we see a part of the plant that doesn't have a node or isn't attaching anything to a node, that's what we consider our roots. And of course, the roots are going to uptake all the nutrients from the soil, the stem is going to provide its support, and then the leaves are going to do things like photosynthesis. Sometimes they're modified into a flower, but that's again a different story. So going back to our non-vascular plants, what classifies a non-vascular plant? They're not going to have vascular tissue, and therefore they can't have true organs. And so these are going to be plants that stay relatively short to the ground, which are your things like your mosses and liverworts. That's what this thing is. And collectively, these are known as bryophytes, and these are your true mosses. Again, because they don't have plant organs, they don't have seeds, and so they're going to rely on spores to reproduce. In fact, that's what these little things right here are where the spores would come out on those. If some of you guys might be wondering what in the world is this guy doing here, this is a bog mummy. They call them B-O-G mummy. And what happens is sphagnum moss, which is a type of non-vascular plant, again, because they don't have these true organs or anything like that, they rely on areas where it's kind of swampy in some cases to survive. And when you have these sphagnum mosses or these different mosses that produce these bogs, they're very acidic. And because of that, they can actually preserve people in different organisms, just like this guy who's over 500 years old, and you can still see all the details in him because of how it was preserved by these plants. Really has nothing to do with plants. I just think it's an interesting thing to talk about when we talk about plants and their uses and things like that. So those are the non-vascular plants. Now we're going to be moving on to everything else in the plant kingdom, which are the vascular plants. And so again, as you can see, our vascular plants make up the vast majority of what we're going to be talking about today. And you can already see that now that we're talking about vascular plants, we're going to have that next division within our plant kingdom, which is the super division of seedless plants and seed plants. So remember, a lot of people get this mixed up when we're talking about seedless plants. Just because they are seedless does not mean they are non-vascular. And just because they are non-vascular does not mean that they are a vascular seedless plant. There's a difference. They are both going to reproduce with spores, but these guys have vascular tissue. Alright, that's a key thing. So a plant that reproduces with spores and has vascular tissue is going to be classified as a seedless plant, not non-vascular. So again, this is our next split, and these include things like ferns. If you have ever seen ferns maybe outside or in the classroom or something like that, sometimes you might notice on the back of those ferns these little brown dots. And what those brown dots are is they're actually places where these spores are developing. Those spores will eventually kind of be taken away by the wind, and once they get wet, they are going to be able to mix with other fern spores and produce a new fern plant. And that's how these plants reproduce. That's how all these seedless vascular plants are going to reproduce, is through spores. And again, because they are vascular, they are going to have true plant organs. So these are going to have your stems. They are going to have leaves, like you can clearly see on these fronds, which are fern leaves. And they are going to have roots as well. And ferns are just one of the many. You also have things known as horsetails, which is what this is, called so because the plant itself, the stem, looks like the bones in a horse's tail, or some people say like when you braid a horse's tail, that's what it looks like. And then these things called club mosses. And again, just because we see the word mosses does not mean it's non-vascular. True mosses are non-vascular, but things like club mosses are a seedless vascular plant. Alright, so those are the seedless. Now on to the seed plants. And again, our seed plants is going to be another split. And this next split is what we call our gymnosperms and angiosperms. So there's a way that I like to tell people to remember the difference between gymnosperms and angiosperms. We're going to go into detail looking at what these are, but long story short, gymnosperms are things like pine trees. They produce with cones. Angiosperms are pretty much any flowering plant that you can think of. If it has a flower, or maybe you don't recognize the plant by its flower but by its fruit, then it's going to be an angiosperm. And so what I like to tell people is to think of this guy named Jim and this guy named Angie, or this lady named Angie. Jim likes to go to the gym and he likes to work out, and after he works out, he likes to use his pine scented body sprays because gymnosperms are things like pine trees. They are cone bearing. So he likes pine scented deodorant. That's Jim. Angie just likes flowers. So angiosperm, think flowering plants. Angie likes flowers. You could also think of Angie likes to get a fruit bouquet, an edible arrangement, because fruits and flowers are all angiosperms. Gymnosperms are the things that produce with a cone, or they're the pine plants. So let's talk about the gymnosperms for a second. This picture is actually out in Arizona. This is what's known as the Mogollon Rim. But around here, we can see all these different gymnosperms, these cone-bearing plants. And that's what gymnosperms are. The word gymnosperm itself literally means naked seed. Gymno referring to naked, and sperm, the word sperm, where we get our word for sperm, it's Latin for seed. And so when we say a gymnosperm, that's a naked seed. And the reason they're called naked seeds is because they don't have a covering around them. Yes, there's a cone, but that cone isn't a fruit. And that's what we're talking about, are fruits. Fruits are coverings. But these plants don't have them. Instead, they are what we call cone bearing. And so, like pine trees, Christmas trees, any type of spruce tree, these are what we call conifers. In other words, they're cone-bearing plants. We also have ones known as ginkgo trees, and in Florida here, it's actually too warm for these trees to survive. But you go up north and you can see some of these, and they don't look like a conifer, in other words, like a Christmas tree or a pine tree, but nonetheless, they don't have fruits, and their seeds are just that. They're like a naked open seed. They have a type of cone that they use. And some of you guys might have noticed this little guy down here and thought, what's a palm tree doing here? That's not a palm tree. This is what we call a cycad. And cycads, they may look very similar to palm trees, but they in fact are a type of gymnosperm, meaning that they don't have fruits, they have a cone that pops out. Sometimes you guys might even see these, whether you're looking at like the little house plants or even plants that are used in landscaping. If you'll see these that look like palm trees, but notice that sometimes they'll have this giant cone that comes out the top, that means it's a cycad. Another characteristic about these gymnosperms is they're some of the oldest and largest plants on Earth. And what do I mean by that? Some of them are so large you can literally drive a tree or a car right through the middle of it. These are things like your redwoods and your sequoias, these giant trees that can grow over 200 feet tall and have this huge diameter. This tree itself was most likely starting to sprout around the time that Jesus was born. That's how old these things are. That's how long they live. And so that's another reason why a lot of these trees today are actually protected, is because it took them so long to become this large. And then last but not least, our last big group that we're going to be talking about are the angiosperms. So gymnosperms are the cone-bearing naked seed. Angiosperm refers to a covered seed. And these covered seeds are covered by fruit. And so fruits are actually just the coverings of seeds. Technically, it's what we call an developed ovary. And if you want to learn more specifically about the flowers and sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction of plants, there's a video that I did for one of my other classes, and I'll put that link in the description. You can go watch that. But for now, all you need to know is that these fruits are the developed ovaries that cover the seeds. Where do the seeds come from? Well, they come from the inside the flowers. When the flower gets pollinated and fertilized, it starts to lose its petals. The ovary develops into a fruit. You eat that fruit and then eat the seeds. And if you can think of something that has a flower on it, it produces a fruit. Likewise, if you can think of any type of fruit, it produces a flower. Sometimes even things that we might not think of as fruits, like a pumpkin or a squash, those are fruits. We consider them a vegetable, speaking culinarily, in other words, like cooking wise, but scientifically, botanically, they are a fruit, and therefore they come from angiosperms. And so we have one final divide between these angiosperms. There are different types of angiosperms, and they're divided into two groups, what are known as monocots and dicots, and this is as far as we're going to be going today. And these monocots and dicots, they are the last of our plant divisions. And what monocot means, mono meaning one, cot referring to what's known as the cotyledon. And what this cotyledon is, it's kind of like the food for the developing embryo, the developing seed. So monocots only have one, dicots are going to have two. These cotyledon also come out as what looks like a leaf prematurely as the seed sprouts. In a monocot, you will see one little kind of leaf. In a dicot, you'll see two little baby leaves come out when it sprouts. And so that's one way to tell if you're looking at a monocot or a dicot. The most easy way, though, the easiest way to tell if you're looking at a monocot versus a dicot, though, if it's a fully formed plant, just look at the leaves. Monocots are going to have what we call parallel venation. In other words, if you look at the veins on a leaf and you see it, they're all going the same way in this straight line, that means that it's a monocot, most likely. In other words, think of a blade of grass. Grass has this parallel venation. So grass is therefore a monocot. Likewise, see this kind of has these net-like structure. There's different versions. There's what we call palmate or pinnate, and then there's even variations on those. But pretty much, if it's not parallel, and you see some structure similar to this in the veins of the leaf, it's most likely a dicot. So if you go outside and you see like an oak tree, just look at an oak leaf. It's going to have venation very similar to this structure right here. It's going to be what we call pinnate, and that would mean it's a dicot. There are other ways that you can look at it microscopically, but we're not going to worry about those looking through the stem. If you are pulling the plants up, like let's say you're helping your parents or your grandparents do some weeding in the garden, and you have to pull it up by its roots. If you see one long taproot, then you know you're looking at a dicot. This one long root here, it's what we call taproot. If there are lots of little roots that all look the same, they're what we know as fibrous roots. If you find a plant with fibrous roots, you're looking at a monocot. And then last but not least, if the plant is in bloom, because remember we are talking about angiosperms here, so all these plants have flowers. If it's in multiples of 3, the petals, or even just the flower parts in general, it's most likely a monocot. If the flower parts are in groups of 4 or 5, it's most likely a dicot. Now, one thing you have to take in consideration with this always isn't necessarily true, because it says multiples of 3 and multiples of 4 or 5. So what if it has 15 petals? 15 is a multiple of 3, and it's also a multiple of 5. So then you would have to look at something like the roots, or probably the easiest thing, just look at the leaves. So if your flower has 15 petals on it, but you see leaves like this, it's most likely a dicot. Whereas if your flower has 15 petals on it and you see leaves like this, it's most likely a monocot. And so again, those are just some different ways, some different characteristics of monocots versus dicots, how you can tell them apart. They're both angiosperms, but they have different characteristics to them. Alright, so before we end, the last thing I want to talk about real quick is just to recap Kingdom Fungi with you guys. At least go over a few of the things that you should have looked at yesterday. So, if you may or may not have read in the textbook where it might have talked about how for a while there, fungi did not have their own kingdom. They were grouped with the plants. They were classified as a type of plant. And there were several reasons for this. One of them being that, they grow up out of the ground just like plants do, and they produce with spores like some plants do. And so for a while it was thought that these guys were a type of plant. However, through genetic testing, through better microscopes, and things like that, we've been able to determine that these are not plants. One of the main things that separates them from being plants is the fact that these are consumers. They are not producers. Consumers meaning that they have to consume things. They can't make their own food. And so these guys here, they're either going to be what's considered a saprophyte or a parasite in most cases. Most of our fungi are actually beneficial saprophytes, which means that they eat dead things. However, there are some that are parasitic. There's a terrible parasitic fungus known as the chytrid fungus, or the chytrid fungus, however you want to pronounce it. And this chytrid fungus is actually doing lots of it's having very devastative effects on the amphibian populations around the world. Close to about a third of all amphibian species are at the risk of extinction because of this fungus. So some of them can be good, some of them can also be bad. Other characteristics about these, yes, they do have cell walls. However, their cell walls are not like plants. Where plants have cell walls made out of cellulose, these guys' cell walls are made out of a protein known as chitin, or chitin, however you pronounce it. Chitin. That was actually one of your words you had to look up yesterday. What was chitin? It's the protein that makes up their cell walls. And so these guys are made up of these individual cells called hyphae, or these groups of cells called hyphae. And what this hypha, plural being, as these hypha come together, they produce this stuff known as mycelium. If you've ever done any raking where there are a lot of dead leaves and you see all this white stuff that looks like roots, it's most likely not roots, but actually the mycelium of these fungi that are cohabitating and helping these plants. And the mycelium is basically the organism itself. This is the fungus. In fact, when you see mushrooms like this, all you're seeing is that the mycelium has developed enough, it's gotten old enough, and it's that time of the year where it's going to reproduce. And so what happens is this mycelium actually develops this hyphae into a mushroom. The entire organism is actually underground, but when it decides it's time to reproduce, it will produce this thing known as a mushroom, which is going to release its spores, and those spores will eventually turn into new fungi somewhere else. And so that's just a little brief overview of Kingdom Plantae and a little quick review on Kingdom Fungi. If you have any questions, make sure to let me know in Remind. and I will talk to you later.